Okay, so we're going to start talking about analysis, which is an important piece in both writing and speaking, and it has to do with how you use your evidence to prove a point. What I want you to notice is that analysis is always made up of two parts, interpretation and commentary. Let's look at what those might be. So in this example from Sherlock, a detective and some police walk into this room. They find this woman in pink on the ground. And the police are wondering if this has been a suicide or a homicide, because there's not a lot to indicate how she died or why she might have died. And Sherlock says, well, of course it was a homicide. Of course someone else was involved. So that's his claim. He believes that someone else is involved in her death. And then he points to some evidence that the police haven't noticed, and he says, well, my evidence is that there's mud on her socks. How did he get there? Well, she was alone in the room. There was no murder weapon found, so why should we believe that someone else was involved? Sherlock's got to do some explanation to connect his evidence to that claim. So first he's going to interpret the evidence. So the evidence that he noticed is there's mud on her socks. His interpretation of that is, well, it was rainy, and so she was carrying a bag, like a rolling suitcase, behind her, and that bag kicked up dirt onto her socks. This points to what's important in the evidence. We might not have noticed what the mud on her socks might have meant, but Sherlock has now interpreted it for us. But does this prove how he knows that someone else was involved in her murder? Probably not. He still needs to explain a little bit more. And so the last question is, how does that prove his claim that someone else was involved? So he's got to add some commentary to his interpretation. So again, his claim is someone else was involved in the woman's death. His evidence is that there was mud on her socks. His interpretation of the mud is that the evidence is important because she was carrying a bag and the bag kicked up mud onto her socks. Now he has to add his commentary. There was nothing else in the room when she was found, so that bag, somebody must have taken the bag that she was carrying. Now we can tell that someone else was involved because of the commentary. So notice that the commentary is the key piece that links back to the claim, but the interpretation explains the evidence, because otherwise the evidence might not make sense. Therefore, in your analysis, you need both interpretation and commentary in order to fully prove your point. Make sure you have these in your notes. Interpretation is the first part of analysis, and it builds off of evidence. It answers the question, what is important in this piece of evidence, or what does this quote mean? Usually interpretation sounds like, in this quote, da-da-da-da, or in other words, blah, 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 because it looks back at the quote or the evidence that it's coming after. The second piece is commentary, and commentary connects the evidence and interpretation back to the claim. Commentary usually answers the question, why does this quote matter in our argument, or how does it prove our point? And it often sounds like, therefore, blah, 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 or this quote proves, blah, blah, blah. Let's look at an example from Together Alone to see how this might look in your essay or your debate. So a claim that you might choose to make about technology is, technology does more harm than good for our ability to be happy and fulfilled. Evidence for that could come from Sherry Turkle. So in Sherry Turkle's article, Together Alone, she notes that the moment that people are alone, they become anxious, they panic, they fidget, they reach for a device. If I'm going to interpret that evidence, I would say, well, in this quote, we see that people struggle to be alone with themselves and unsuccessfully try to solve their loneliness through the use of technology. So what I'm doing is paraphrasing or highlighting what I think is most important about the evidence that I've chosen. So again, interpretation builds on the evidence. And now my commentary has to link back to that claim in red. My commentary is, this proves that the way we attempt to cope with our feelings using technology actually makes us lonelier and more unhappy. So notice that the orange commentary connects back to this idea that technology does more harm than good, and it explains how the evidence and interpretation back up that claim. So again, analysis has two parts, interpretation and commentary. A reminder that interpretation connects back to the evidence. Okay, so if you notice the underlined part in the evidence, people are alone, they become anxious. My interpretation of that is underlined here. People are struggling to be alone with themselves. So I'm explaining what I think she means by saying that people become anxious without their phones or when they're by themselves, as people are struggling to be alone with themselves. So again, you're paraphrasing what you see in the evidence. Commentary connects back to the claim. So the claim that technology does more harm than good for our ability to be happy and fulfilled, I've kind of paraphrased that in my commentary. It makes us lonelier and more unhappy. So I connect back to the claim in different words. And that's it. So remember that the job of analysis is to explain evidence and connect it to a claim, and that's how you prove your point. Analysis has two parts. First, interpretation, and then commentary to connect it back to the claim. So your analysis is almost always going to be at least 2 sentences, and that's what we'll be doing in your debate and your analysis benchmark. Hope it sticks.